set me up?
Can we have someone set up the presentation? Yeah, it's right here. I would urge all of you to please take your seats.
Morning, everyone. They needed some visual break, I think, between the two heavyweights who are speaking before and after me. So I'll try and do my best to hold your attention.
You can sing.
You can make out the cold. I'm just guessing, is this the pointer which works? Whoops. Oops. Give me a sec. Yeah. Once I get familiar, I'll be with it. Okay. I'm just going to try and do this really quickly because we have 30 minutes, as you know. It's a quick summary. I'm not going to read it out to you of what I'm going to speak. I'll do it again at the end for you. So just bear with me. I'm trying to give you some context because there's been so much gloom and doom around the country to give you a sense of what actually India has already achieved and where we are poised to go from here. This is how I think the average Indian thinks of himself or herself, that we used to be about 30% of global GDP, if you look at the orange areas, and we missed one trick in the Industrial Revolution. We missed the invention of the steam engine, and look where we went. And you went from 30% of the world to less than 3% of the world. And while China is coming back, which is the red kind of area, India is still performing far, far below its potential. Having said that, I've benefited from the last 30 years when the stock market really, as Anilji was saying, opened up and allowed entrepreneurship and a more kind of liberal feel in the economy. The economy has grown by 10x. I think our exports and imports, as we integrated with the world, went up more than 30x. Why does this keep vanishing? Sorry. And of course, stock market cap went up tremendously, and we've all benefited from that, and we think we're poised to do even better from there. We're seen as a top 5 economy in the world. We just lost one spot on the market cap ranking when Saudi Aramco decided they want a $2 trillion valuation and crossed our market cap briefly. But we do think we'll get to probably 3rd largest market cap in the world in the coming decade. A very interesting slide with also Anilji referred to. If you think of the country on the right side, it's the size of population, for example, of Maharashtra, where we are present, is equal to the whole of Japan, and the GDP of the state is only equal to Singapore. Similarly, if you look at our largest state, which is Uttar Pradesh, on the top right in the red, the GDP of the state of UP is only equal to Qatar. That's the extent of the miss of our potential in this country. So why this country cannot be already more than 5 trillion, 10 trillion, 15 trillion is really the question that we ought to be asking ourselves over here. Just to put in context, we have this whole image of the poor Indian farmer dying and there's agri-distress all around the country. The reality is actually different. We are the largest agricultural producer in the world, and we do pretty well for ourselves. So despite all the politics and the media that you learn, it is a self-sufficient country in all the agriculture that it produces. It's a fairly okay infrastructure. I know we complain about our trains and our buses and our roads not working, but for a country and complexity of this size, to actually create infrastructure ahead of itself is not a small task. So we do have a lot to do here, but having said that, it's not insubstantial what has already been created over here. Similarly, on industry, as Anilji said, we just probably produce very, very small fraction of what we are capable of doing. But it is already a very, very large producer of most commodities in the world. So if you look at steel, we've just crossed Japan, and now with the resolution of SR and Bhushan, I think we'll be closer to 150 million tons of steel in the next year itself. 500 million tons of cement being produced in the country and so on. So there is a miss on, and I'll come to on the consumption side of why we are missing on the two-wheeler and the four-wheeler and so on, and what the potential is. But just to set the stage that what we've achieved so far is not really bad, and we shouldn't be kind of breaking our backs over saying that India's doom and gloom and nothing's ever going to come back over here. Similarly, this whole talk about the young educated population and where are they coming from and so on. 900 universities, 32 million people graduating every year. Now you may argue the quality is not great or they're not getting enough jobs and so on, but the fact is they're out there, and if you can skill them and get them into the workforce, this is a very, very large resource available to this country, and it's setting the base for what I think hopefully lies ahead of us. I'd like to spend 2 minutes on this chart because we love to think of India as this big, bottom of the pyramid market where there's so much of potential and so on. The reality is we look more like an obelisk, where there's a very, very large base, which is really like Africa, and we really don't have per capita income over there. And the top end, with the so-called rich in India, are actually not really rich. We're like the average Mexicans. So when you think of people owning cars and they're called the rich people, and you think of people owning air conditioners, they're basically per capita income levels resemble that of Mexico. And you shouldn't be beating up people for owning a Maruti car. It's certainly not a luxury car. And, Akash is in the first row, and we often joke about this. I just want to take a quick audience poll on how many S-class Mercedes do you think is sold in India? People complain about this country being rich and the rich exploiting the poor and so on. Do you know how many S-class Mercedes cars are sold in India? In the full year, 300 cars. It's shocking for a country of this size, which thinks, we have a big market and so much of wealth. It's not really a big car market. It's Marutis and Hyundais which are kind of dominating it. And there's a slide, again, I'd like to spend 2 minutes, it looks a bit complex, of thinking about the future and also the disappointment about the present. That if you'll focus on the yellow line, the yellow curve, is where consumption was in India in the year 1990 when I started out. In the year 2000. Lots of people with low incomes sitting on the complete extreme right of the chart, and very, very few people in the middle class and almost non-existent rich class. And the consumption categories we've cut were, if you take from the bottom bubble where the mortgage number is given of how many people are buying homes on mortgage, and let's just take that as a $100,000 home, the next category of bubble was a $10,000 car, and the third category bubble was a $1,000 consumer durable, your AC or your fridge or your mobile phone or whatever you call it. If you see where consumption was in India in the year 2000, as recently as that, 500,000 air conditioners sold in a country, and it's a pretty hot country. Then as, in theory, the country progresses, you go to the red line at the bottom, where a few more people come in and they can start consuming. And you go from 500,000 ACs to a grand total of 2.5 million air conditioners sold in India. And even today as we speak, and these were numbers, I just kept it deliberately of what the forecast was, which we guys used to do 10 years ago, and the basis on which a lot of investors take bets in India. We had hoped we would reach 18 million air conditioners. We are probably close to 6 million. Similarly, we were hopeful we would sell close to 12 million cars. We are barely nudging 3.5 million cars. We are hopeful of crossing 35 million bikes, two-wheelers, which is where China peaked many, many years ago, and now they've dropped off as they've all migrated to cars. We had barely 20 million bikes and so on. And a stunning statistic for a country which is a $3 trillion economy with a 25% saving rate. So we save $750 billion a year. And we claim we put half of that into real assets and not financial assets. So there's $375 billion of money going into real assets, which is property and gold. Although I disagree on the gold, but let's say there's $300 billion going annually into purchase of property in this country. The aggregate stock of mortgages outstanding in this country is 240 billion. So people are not going out, taking a mortgage and buying home. They're still going and buying it cash down. And the issue in this country is that we're not able to monetize all that land and bring it into productive use by, in a sense, financializing the economy. So the consumption has really disappointed, and a lot of consumer stocks which people complain about are priced very high are actually looking at the J curve. If eventually we do climb that ladder and the Africans become the Filipinos and the Filipinos become the Mexicans, then there is fabulous amount of consumption still available in the country. And therefore you should be 10x, 15x larger in most categories than what you are today. And that's really the reason to be, as investors, you tend to be optimistic and look at it as a half glass empty rather than a half glass full. And that's really where we stand today. Again, to bring out the point which was made earlier also by the RBI governor, that consumption in India tends to be unorganized, and they're not really coming into the compliance sector, paying their taxes. So everyone's consuming, but they're buying goods which are produced locally and not really coming into the mainstream of the economy. So between a third to two-thirds of the economy is still running without in a sort of compliant manner of producing quality product. And to just give you a stunning statistic again, when I'll come to sort of the financial figures of the government towards the end, if you think of GST in India, it's applicable on pretty much everything. just exclude 20% of agriculture. So that's 80% of GDP ought to be paying GST. And the sort of revenue neutral wage which they calculate between the exempt goods, the 5% category, the 12% category, the 18% and the 28%. Let's just argument's sake say 15% is the average GST you ought to be paying on 80% of the country's GDP. We should be having 12% of GDP as GST collections. And the number today is about 4%. So it tells you already that only 1/3 of the country is really paying GST, and therefore that's the extent of the tax miss. And that's really where the compliance ought to be focused on, rather than, as Mr. Agarwal was saying, squeezing more and more blood from the bone, and the poor Mexicans at the top who seem to be paying all the taxes. And we're forgetting about what's going on in Philippines and Africa over here. This gets reflected naturally in very, very narrow markets. You don't need to read the stat. I'll give you a quick graph on that. 8 companies or 7 companies are 25% of India's total market capitalization. It shouldn't be surprising. A lot of them now service sectors outside India, as well as straddle sectors. The next 18 or 19 are probably the next 25%. So in 29 companies, you pretty much got half of India covered. So when you're expressing surprise at why is this market so high, it's really these companies. And they ought to be, because they've climbed to the top of the obelisk and proven themselves against the best competition in the world. It's not a surprise. Just visually, that's what the companies look like. A lot of them still dominated by basic materials and energy. A lot of, obviously, wealth being created in the last 5 years in the banking, financial, insurance space. Consumer stocks are valued very highly, but I'll show you on the next slide, profits are still quite elusive over there. And then, of course, the big telecom and tech stocks, although telecoms had its share of troubles recently. Just if you hold the figure in your head on the left, 21% of market cap is energy, materials, utility. But in terms of profit, it's 38%. So if you need to create cash flow to allow people to invest and start the investment cycle, while we may love the consumer sectors and the tech sectors which aren't yet producing that level of profit, there is no choice but to go down that path and, in a sense, revive the whole manufacturing environment in the country. Just quickly jumping ahead, because we don't only think old economy, we are rising. Rajan's coming and he's going to speak a bit later about the new world which is coming up. We are rising over there. A good slide which says, we're already number 4 on the list of unicorns coming up. We've produced 4 or 5 decacorns, which are $10 billion companies from India. So clearly the talent pool is there. The opportunity is there. The sad news is bulk of these companies are already held by foreign investors. So you're not going to see the wealth creation happening here. So even, for example, when Flipkart was sold for $15, $16 billion, bulk of the money went to Singapore. It didn't really come into India. The Prime Minister has put out a vision of all the kinds of things we love to hear, and we love, if they would all come true. Especially as Mr. Agarwal was saying, point number 10 was this big mantra of minimum government and maximum governance. If we got there, life would be hunky-dory for all of us, and I bet you the economy would have been doing well by now. So they have done all these things, and I, again, won't dwell on it. You've got these structural reforms of IBC, GST, real estate code, and so on going around. They have done the right things in terms of putting a digitization program, getting the whole social inclusion program going, and so on. So it's not to just crib and complain all the time that India ought to be doing better with deep structural reforms that are actually underway. And they are trying to make, like I said, the 2/3 of the country which is not really coming into the compliance or the organized sector to try and get them into more compliance. And it's a bit mystifying. At one end, we want people to be more compliant. At the other end, we want the license Raj and the inspector Raj in some sense to end. And how to get this fine balance going is really the challenge that the country faces. And that really comes back to then finally what's the administrative skill, what's the culture you're setting for the whole government machinery and so on. And I'll come to that also in a minute. They have been focused, actually, I must confess, on ease of doing business. We have gone up the rankings there. They do say we will get to top 50 next year. The aim is to get to top 25 within the next 4 years by the time we get to 2024. And I think back of their minds, they know they better get into top 10 if you want to attract investment. No one goes looking for a country which is number 25. They will look for country number 1 to 5 if they want to put the incremental dollar to work. And yet, despite all these good things, this great potential, The rupee is down 70% since the global financial crisis. And this is something which mystifies me, that if the rupee was 40 and it wasn't 72, we would already be a $5 trillion economy. So what are we missing here? I'm not an economist, but what has this depreciation of the rupee given us other than importing inflation as a largely import-dependent country? Then you import the inflation, you get the inflation going, then you say, oh, now I need to put interest rates up. And then you put interest rates up and you slow the economy even further. And you know what? All the issues in the economy are not about excess money supply, it's about supply side. If the supply side response is not going to come, whatever you do to interest rates, you're not going to get inflation down, and as has been evidenced over the years. So if this conclave can take one discussion point away, is a discussion on the rupee. Who are we competing against? If the Chinese yuan is pegged to the US dollar, and they haven't moved for the last 10 years, and we are down 70%, how come exports haven't taken off in India, if that was the root cause of us being uncompetitive? And even today, people argue about real effective exchange rate and India being, overvalued. It completely foxes me if the yuan is still equal to the US dollar and it's still holding the price it had 10 years ago. What the hell is going on with our currency policy and what's going on with our export competitiveness? Also, if Indian industry complains about not being able to sell goods in India, what are we doing about exporting from here? So is it the quality of product isn't good? Is it we don't have the infrastructure? At least I can't understand what's going on here. And the competitive sectors, whether it's Mr. Agarwal or whether it's the IT sector, they never come complaining about the rupee. And they're competing with the best in the world. So this seems to me one of these great Indian myths, that you need the rupee to keep depreciating. In theory, if we went and said we're going to peg to the dollar, what happens? In the capital markets view or a private equity view, you've taken away uncertainty about the currency. So my cost of capital for doing business in India collapsed dramatically, because I now don't look for a 25-30% dollarized IRR. I can look for a lower number. Number two, I don't put the risk premium. And number three, I know I can extract and take my capital back very quickly. So something which really needs serious thought in a world where $13 trillion is sloshing around at negative interest rates. Why on earth is India trying to develop projects with a 25% IRR? If you give certainty to the world at 10 and 12% dollar returns for a lot of our infrastructure assets, I can assure you there'll be hundreds of billions of dollars flowing into this country and not the piddly 30, 40 of FDI that we get every year and get so excited about. And again, something to dwell on. And I hate doing numbers in a large group like this. But if you just focus on this, you'll get very commonsensical answers. If our 65% of this GDP is service sector, and definitely it cannot come as an export number, and 15% is agriculture. So 80% of India cannot be exporting anything by definition. So you know the export number of 12% cannot be 12 on 20. So what this means is you're buying goods from abroad. For example, a Reliance will buy oil from abroad, process it here and then ship it out. Or a diamond merchant will buy diamonds from abroad, process it here and ship it out. So your real export number is probably 4-5% of GDP. And that will also deflate your import number. So that's really the extent of our involvement with the rest of the world. The problem is if 5% of GDP is oil imports, and for 30 years since we've liberalized, and Mr. Agarwal's been around for almost as long, why can't the country have a policy for energy security? If you're spending $150 billion a year to buy fuel from overseas, the single-minded approach would have been to go after the nuclear deal, to go after solar, to go after wind, to go after letting every single person in the world come and dig for oil in India. And like the gentleman, Mr. Agarwal said before me, there is ample hydrocarbon reserves in this country. The government has to get out of the way, and this 5% of oil import business has to become zero. And this is the cause of vulnerability, this is the cause of rupee tumbling, this is the cause of us getting poor. And what happens today, we get excited that Reliance is going to get a $15 billion investment from overseas to buy 20% of the company. That's basically the 150 we are paying to buy oil every year is coming back by way of buying our capital assets, and only a fraction of that. So as an Indian, I feel happy, I'm very unhappy about the way we are running our country. And it cuts across, it's not a political statement, but it's really how poorly the macroeconomic policy of this country is being handled. You go down, you're surviving on that minus 6% trade deficit number by 3% coming from software exports, and we know the future is going to be robotics and artificial intelligence, and that number may be at some stress. And you get 2% from all the poor chaps working in the Gulf or rest of the world remitting money back to India, on which really We have no right if they choose to not send it. It makes for a very vulnerable balance of payments situation for a country aspiring to be number 3 in the world. This currency has to get stronger. It has to get more traded frequently. If I'm a large buyer of $150 billion of oil, I would go and negotiate and say, I'm only going to pay you in rupees. I'm not going to pay you dollars anymore. Where are they going to sell it? You take 2%, 3% of global demand off the market, which is India, you will cause a tumble in oil prices. Why are we so defensive in the way we handle ourselves all the time? And then you look on the right side, we have this great hoo-ha being made about FDI and India being a great destination. It's 1% of GDP, $35 billion, and that includes, they count the private equity money coming in also in there. And a lot of the private equity money is coming in for the new tech businesses, which are really looking for consumer tech or for financial services, not really for building something unique over here. And then you remain vulnerable to banking and capital flows. And it's this tail which is wagging the dog on the currency markets. Again, if you sit and think, this country has $450 billion of dollar reserves. Just absorb that number. $450 billion is sitting, lending money back to the developed world at 2% in a country which is starved of capital. Is that the best use of resources of the country? $450 billion is 15% of our GDP is sitting in a bank account doing nothing. It's just memory of 1990 that we had a foreign exchange crisis. This is a world where the foreign exchange which we are looking at is in a crisis. They print $450 billion in 6 months. What we've inherited is an electronic account where we are holding assets which are basically becoming worthless every 6 months. So the orthodoxy of economic management in some sense has to get shaken out of its stupor to see how we want to handle this. Again, very quickly, I have 4 minutes, so I'll try and run quickly. On our budget, which every year we come, if someone presents you a P&L in this manner, mixing your cash flows with your capex, with your P&L, you would be pretty unhappy about that situation. Reality is we collect 12% of GDP. I call it the 3-4-5 formula. 3% is personal taxes, 4% is corporate taxes, 5% is indirect taxes. And I already showed you, you can't squeeze anything more out of personal taxes or corporate taxes with profits being so low. But 5% indirect taxes, which covers petroleum, GST, everything, which ought to be at 12, you need to be going after that part of the country to get more tax collections here. And unfortunately, on the other side, you're spending all the money on interest, subsidies, and collecting this 12%. So there's no hope for people looking for a fiscal stimulus. This government doesn't have money to spend, and the money we are paying as taxes are not going into creating assets. We spend 1% on capex. And that includes defense capex, which was the last aircraft India bought after Mirage 2000. It was in 1990. It's a 30-year-old aircraft, and now we have a defense with 4 Rafale aircraft going to be delivered by next May. That can't be the defense spend of a country of this magnitude. And we have this Make in India policy that we'll come and build defense assets and so on over here, road assets. It's quite shocking when you think of it in that context. So running ahead quickly, issue is households are unlevered. We've got ample money. If you get out of the way, let us get on with life. Issue is government debt. If 3.5% of GDP is interest cost, that implies 60% of GDP is government debt. For a person who collects 8%, if your revenue is 8 and your debt is 60, I don't know how you'll be thought about in financial markets, which is why you don't go overseas to borrow. So real macro management has to improve dramatically over here. I don't need to dwell on reforms. Enough people have put enough statements out there about, Nandan, for example, has devised on use of technology, judicial reforms, and so on. The previous RBI governors put a fairly robust reform roadmap on factors of production. I have some thoughts which, due to lack of time, I won't do today, and Nikun just promised to pick up programs, but largely to do around, when Mr. Agarwal used the word collector, it strikes a chord, doesn't it? That if the government thinks of someone, you the citizen, I need to collect from you. He doesn't think of you as a customer for who I have to do business development. And we talk of it being Bharat Sarkar. I thought that when we ended the royalty and we ended the British Raj over here. Why should the government be called and referred to as Sarkar? So if we can get this movement together with government and private sector going together, I think potential is phenomenal. These are just quick factors of production. I mean, there's nothing new. A lot of people have spoken about it. I will dwell at appropriate forum on these. let me quickly jump through this. This was the one-page crib sheet if someone just needed that. Oops. So lots to be done, but like I said in the beginning, lots has happened, so let's not keep beating ourselves up. And the intentions are right, we are going in the right path, and I am sure we will go there. Another, just quickly to use the last remaining time, is to get a semblance of what market cycles are. We often panic about, the fact that, the economy is at a low and, what's going on here. The markets really are forward mechanisms for discounting, and I'll just quickly run through a great slide from Mark Faber. In the beginning, you have this undervaluation, no one wants anything, then you get a catalyst. And that catalyst usually could be a regulatory change. For example, you had disinvestment in 2002-03 in NDA1, which just kick-started the animal spirits. I would assume things like the corporate tax cuts now, or again the insolvency code where getting assets cheap, or government could open up 2 or 3 sectors again quickly over here, could kickstart the whole investment cycle. Then that spreads to category 2 people, and the skeptical people get drawn in and so on. Then eventually you get to this time is different and the multiples will expand. You get to a shock right at the top when you may get a demonetization or something like that coming through, market cracks. People who are left out jump back in. Phase 5 is when slowly smart money is getting out, market narrows, and leadership becomes narrower and narrower till you have a final bust as you do now. And then everyone and his uncle, whether it's Reserve Bank, whether it's industry, whether it's government, everyone's jumping to try and kickstart the economy and do their bit for it, which we are all in this together and we'll make it happen. That's where we are. So inflation's kind of come off, as you see at the bottom. Markets already kind of anticipating deep reform happening in India in periods like this when our backs are to the wall. And therefore we look at better times ahead. Having said that, Nikunj asked me at the end if I could quickly just say, irrespective of the macro, how come so many guys have created so much wealth here? And we had this secret formula we gave him, that look for people who are not yet the tempestuous 30s and not yet the kind of old 60 years who've kind of got out of energy. So if you see the age of every decade, in the 1990s, you could see Narayan Murthy or Aditya Puri and so on were kind of in the golden era of being 40-year-olds. And you can see the stock return in the third last column. Then you go to 2000s, and you get all Mr. Ambani and Mr. Kotak and Sunil Mittal and so on, again in the right age group, and you saw the CAGR for them. The last decade, you got Chandra and Sanjeev and all the others coming in the right age category, and they've become the great leaders. And the next slide doesn't come from me. He just put together people in the 40s, so that's the disclaimer. There are people who happen to be in the right age group, so watch them carefully. I know Vibha is going to be speaking later, and that stock's already very, very well valued, as is Bajaj. But it's interesting that even real estate, a sector which we don't like, is actually now being looked at positively with the changes in the real estate and regulatory act over there, and so on. Some themes to look ahead for us. We think financialization is a big deal, and there is going to be great wealth created there, irrespective of macro. I think privatization is here for real. It is going to happen, and all these platform plays will become very, very large wealth creators. I think Hindustan Zinc was one of those which made 200x. You will get greater urbanization. So as the population will urbanize, you'll get more healthcare, you'll get more education, you'll get more urban transport and so on. And a lot of players, for example, when he spoke about the airports in India, if you now land in Delhi or Bombay, it's a great experience compared to what it was when the governments ran it. And there is money to be made there. And lastly, of course, as you go up the income curve and you go from being an African to a Filipino to a Mexican, if I may keep using those terms, the ability to spend more on discretionary purchases definitely expands. And we remain therefore more bullish on that sort of category. Like with everything else in life, there are risks. We can blow ourselves up. 100 years ago, Venezuela was rated the greatest country with the greatest potential in the world. They didn't seize the opportunity, they missed it. We have the great demographic dividend. We have a great set of leadership in the country. We have the attention of the world. The country seems to have the entrepreneurial talent as well and the resources. So if only we can kind of put this all together and manage ourselves better and kind of really work in partnership with each other, I think potential is clearly there for us to not just hit the 5 trillion but actually surpass. Because I think in the coming 4 or 5 years, you will see big movements in the currency markets, which will give us natural buoyancy as well. Because we just used to 5% depreciation. We haven't seen a 20% appreciation in the currency. And I can't for life of me fathom why the UK pound is still at 95 and why is it not at 40. With all oil going out and financial sector going out, real the retail trade vanishing, what's going on in that country, other than buying property in London. So that's just a quick summary of what I spoke about. So we've had this glorious past. We think of ourselves as this country which should be justifiably 20-30% of global GDP with that size of population. Reforms have actually produced results, so let's not beat ourselves up. And a lot of it is still ongoing. Again, like Vaidhi said right in the beginning, when you churn the ocean, the poison comes out first. And a lot of people feel this slowdown is unprecedented. I can tell you, if you were around in 91, 92, it felt like India was flat on its back as well. When the first set of reforms came out and the stock market scandal came out, you would think, what the hell am I doing in this country? So it is a cycle. It will play out. And the intentions are right. And I think the government and all the officers are focused on doing the right things. Sometimes you just need that last mile to kind of get connected together. The world certainly does think of this as a country which will claim the spot of third largest GDP in the world. And I can assure you there's tremendous amount of capital available looking to get invested in India. We're just not able to find the receptacles to take in not 30, 40, 50 billion, but actually 100, 200 billion dollars of capital from the world, if not more. Reform measures I've told you already, and again, like I said, investors remain completely optimistic. It's reflected in the stock markets. We think we will get there, and we'll get there faster than most people assume, because unlike most people here, I have a bullish view on where our currency ought to be as well, and I hope we'll get there eventually. Thanks for listening. We have time? So they want me to hang here for 5 minutes more, so we can take some questions if you like. If you have a moderator, they can come up here, or I'm happy to take it.
Thank you for that. And yes, indeed, we do have a mic in the audience, so I request you to please pass it on, or whoever has it. Go ahead with your question for Mr. Chokhani.
No, it's not on.
No. Can you switch on the mic, please, for him? Yeah.
One of the points you raised about the difference between the interest rate in Europe and in India.
Sure.
And I'm based in Belgium. Each time I see investment coming in Belgium, I see it's a huge investment. And then there is a minus interest rate.
Sure.
How can India compete with that 10% on one side and minus over there? You raised the point very well, but what's the solution?
I think if we had decided to have a currency peg, well, maybe now it's a bit too late, because those currencies, in my view, should all tumble. But if you think of it, that's what China did, right? They created a wall around their consumer market, but they kept their currency market completely kind of pegged to the US dollar. And that sucked in so much capital into that country, which allowed them to build their infrastructure. And they focused cleverly on getting the wealth creation done through the consumer market by forcing foreigners to share equity of anything that did in the country for serving the consumer with the local entrepreneur or the local markets. Tremendous wealth creation is possible here. So it's just like the orthodoxy of our economic policy making, in a sense, has to just get twisted around. And we have the brightest brain, so it's not like I'm saying something very unique over here.
All right. Does anyone else like to take a
there's
question?
one at the back there, actually two.
Yeah, hi. When you take a look at the global macro perspectives, all right, and
Sorry, can you
hi,
say
can you hear me? Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, I mean, as far as the global macro perspectives are concerned, whenever there's a cyclical inversion of the curves,
Sure.
all right, and it kind of rattles the markets. Why shouldn't India be immune to that? Number one, and number two, being that when you took like a lot of foreign portfolios, right, they are donning a lot of money into the economy in terms of like ECB external commercial borrowings, the FCCBs, convertible bonds, exchangeable bonds, and also the RDBs. So when there's so much interest by the foreign, we are one of those, and so taking that into account, so I mean, like, do you see an inflection point, as to?
So you'll get me in trouble, but see, it's a signal we give as well, right? Because that 1% of foreign inflows is kind of the tail wagging the doll, because at the margin, that's the money which could flow out. It's not that $500 billion is going to flow out of India because of taper and so on. But you have a cash flow mismatch in that period when the inflows don't come in. At that time, our stated policy of India has always been that we don't intervene in the currency markets, we only smoothen volatility. And financial markets pick that as saying, okay, you don't want to hold the currency, we can knock it, and no one's going to come and defend it. But if you said, I have $450 billion of reserves, how much of currency can flow out in this period, and I want to stand behind it? Nothing would have happened to your currency. And then we ourselves keep writing articles in India about real effective exchange rate being overvalued. I want to know for the last 12 years, which currency, is it euro, is it yen, is it the British pound? What has actually fallen 70% against the dollar? How come the Indian rupee is seen as overvalued? So it's a mindset shift in my view. And again, I'm not an economist, I'm just giving a businessman and an investor's view in life.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, the gentleman behind you, if you could just pass on the mic.
Hi, my name is Inderpal Singh. My question is also on the currency side. In fact, I had come prepared to ask that question. It's good that it's happening at this forum. I ran through some statistics with reference to China. And I saw that during the period of 2005 to 2015, 10 years, the yuan versus the dollar was at 8, and they allowed it to strengthen to 6. Yeah? And in that intervening period of 10 years, their foreign exchange reserves, which were at $500 billion, went up to $4 trillion. And their exports, which were at $773 billion, went up to $2.5 trillion. So this is actually to complement what you were saying, that there's no reason to believe why should we be depreciating the rupee year on year, whereas the stand should be to let it appreciate gradually, number one. Number two is I advise a lot of high net worth investors, international investors who invest not only into India but in other markets as well. Yeah? I'll just give a very simple example. There are a lot of options available to international investors. Now, if you have to attract foreign capital, you need to give them returns in relative terms, relative to what is available outside India. I'll give you a very simple example. A Government of India risk bond, which is traded in US dollars, the average yield today is at about 4.5%. Now, internationally, leverage is available at about 2.5%. And you can leverage up to 3 times of what you invest in terms of your own capital. Now, if I am a foreigner, if I am an NRI, I service NRI, so I'm speaking from that perspective. If I am an NRI and if I have money to invest, other than the patriotic zeal that I may have to invest in India, if I invest this money into a Government of India bond at 4.5% and I take leverage at 2.5%, there's an incremental 2% to be made for every 1:1 leverage. So I'm allowed 3 times leverage. So 2
I
into
understand.
3
You make 15%
is
on a Government of India bond.
15%. Why
Yeah.
the hell should I bring my money to India?
Sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely right. Yeah. So thanks for the similar comment.
The idea.
Is that good enough? I should take off?
No, I thought there was a reply.
No,
No?
that was a comment from him. He's not seeking a reply.
I was wondering, is that a question?
We do that in closed door
We'll
forums.
do that next year. Point taken on that one. But Manish, I just wanted to ask you about divestment. And we've been talking about since the midterm budget about how privatization is something that the government should urgently look at. While it may look very positive on paper, according to you, what could be the challenges as the government picks these PSUs to privatize?
I think we ourselves create problems because you have evidence. The first NDA government, in their wisdom, they had thought about it very strategically, in my view, and said if you keep selling in dribs and drabs in the market, and we used to work with them, you'll keep creating supply and you'll depress the value of your own assets. And that's the case today. The entire public sector banking sector market cap is less than the largest single private sector bank. And public sector banks have 70% share of deposits. So this is clearly the market signaling what they think of the future of public sector versus private sector. If I take the aggregate public sector listed stocks today, I think, if I'm not mistaken, their market cap in aggregate is now less than Reliance Industries. And you already saw there's ONGC, IOC, BPCL, NTPC, Coal India, like so many in there. So the strategic value of these assets is incredible. And like NDA 1 had seen, they picked and they gave one asset to a foreigner, which is Maruti, went to Suzuki. They gave one to Reliance, which went to IPCL. And when I say give, it ended up that way through the auction process. They ended up giving Hindustan Zinc to Anil Agarwal, which I think was intended that Birlas were then the king of non-ferrous and so on, and they missed it, so Anil Agarwal got his chance. And the Tatas were given VSNL. So that whole ignition of the economy started from there because animal spirits got revived and people started feeling buoyant about that this government's got my back and we're in this together. And right now you hear comments where people are a bit fearful, as they say, now maybe for right or wrong reasons, as the country ought to get more compliant. But that animal spirit in that sense is missing. And I do think that this privatization can be a big, big catalyst for the country. And
You
two,
know-
if they do just this changeover of doing away with the term of collector becoming a business development manager, things like that would send a spark of energy, I would imagine.
I can see that in your eyes already. One last question from the audience. Yes, the lady behind.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chokhani. I'm Mrs. Smita Agarwal from Millennium Mams, Kolkata. Sir, you just mentioned that we are with a reserve of $450 billion of comfortable reserves. Sir, could you please give your opinion on the convertibility of rupee?
I wish it would happen yesterday. Fifth largest country in the world not having a currency which is freely tradable is a travesty. And if you're going to be third largest, and you even go down, you go to a tiny bankrupt country like Greece because they're part of the European Union, even there the currency is convertible. Or you go to Brazil, you can convert the real. I mean, it's a third world country. You go to Russia. All these currencies are convertible. We have this fear, and I think maybe a 1960s orthodoxy or the pain of the 1990 forex crisis, which is holding us back. And we've seen every time people open up, you actually attract more than what goes away. So again, I'm a free markets guy, so I'm going to say that, and maybe the right answer is to ask the government why they aren't doing it and what the fear is over there.
Thank you, sir. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Okay, Manish, since you brought up the topic of Mercedes, allow me to talk about the auto sector in the grips of a slowdown. You were just talking about the return of the animal spirit. We've heard some corporates talk about a green shoot of recovery within autos. Where do you stand here?
No, auto sector will take time. I think we did a series of missteps about signaling, transition to BS6, this whole diesel ban, then this odd and even in Delhi. And if people think there's a model which is going to come out next year, which is going to affect the value of my current car, you think about resale value. So a lot of people will just hold back. And it's to do with uncertainty that we create in people's minds and consumers' minds. The second, of course, is like with most things in India, there's no one truth. There's always a relative truth. A lot of the auto dealers in India, because they got cheap financing from the banks, diverted money away into real estate and stock markets. And banks have started clamping down there as well. So you've got a combination of, the regime change as well as lack of availability of money, which just ends up squeezing demand over there. But when it turns, I would expect it to turn very, very dramatically. We can't be selling 3 million cars in a country of, 125 crores, which is, 1.3 billion people. 3 million cars just doesn't make sense. And China, just let me remind you, at peak went to 27 million cars. It's the same population.
Yeah.
And the average car is the Toyota Altis. Our average car is still the Maruti Alto. So it's actually a 30 times bigger market. And the auto sector, as you know, is a very large employment generator with all the ancillaries and everything as well.
Right. A question right here in the front.
Hi, Mr. Chokhani, Nantara here. So, great suggestion as far as, why does China have a fixed currency? We don't, all of that against the dollar. My question to you is that even if it was ever to be implemented here, how would you decide what the value should be? Because you talked about appreciation. Why do you want to kill exports as well? And when I say exports, it shouldn't only mean IT, right? What about the textile guys, the manufacturing guys?
So I want to hold you, Nanda. That's the challenge in our country. The rupee is down 70 to 80% in the last decade against China. The Chinese have put their labor costs also up, right? Despite it, if you're not able to compete, the answer is not the rupee. That's what Einstein would say. You do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. If we are down 70%, we depreciate every year and still export looks like a flat line. Something's clearly not worked over here. Also, why are you not part of global supply chains already? Why were we waiting for Donald Trump to do a trade war? The whole world wants a second source of supply. They don't want to be only in China. The Vietnamese market has had 300% increase in their exports, and they are now ahead of India. Bangladesh exports more textiles than India today. So it's not about the currency anymore. If currency was the way, Bangladesh should have been the largest exporter in the world. Till 2015, Germany was the largest exporter in the world with the strongest currency. China, even now, with a pegged currency to the dollar, is able to compete. So there's something with our mindset which says the answer is, currency. And like I said, our net exports is only 4%. How can 4% of the country impoverish the rest of the country? Now you don't have purchasing power to buy your car and your two-wheeler and your home. If we had remained at 40 to the dollar, we would have already been 5 trillion. You would have had purchasing power in our hands. All we've done is transferred our purchasing power overseas. And then we go and lend them money at 2% by holding reserves. So we've done exactly the opposite in many ways.
We actually have a representative from an oil PSU here who will be very happy to hear about the 40, right?
Would you have any question? No. Okay. Manish, just one question. On a very micro level, since the next event for us after Indian Economic Conclave is going to be the budget, and I know you believe that the budget is really a non-event, but there's a lot of chatter around as to how personal income taxes could be sort of brought down the slabs. Do you really think that money, which is going to be in the hand of the consumer, is really going to be enough to try and revive the consumer sentiment? If you have more money saved from income taxes, would you really go out and buy that car, the soap and the shampoo?
So, well, like I said, 3% of India's taxes coming from personal income tax. And household savings, we know, have been falling for the last 10 years. And they've gone down to 17% or thereabouts of our total GDP. If on 17% we're paying 3% aggregate tax, it's already close to 20%. And we know people at the bottom of the pyramid who are earning 3, 4, 5 lakhs are pretty much not paying any tax. So it's only people above that. And those people have discretionary income therefore available, that if you get a tax cut, you have extra income in your hand to go and spend. And you could achieve it if, for example, your currency was stronger, you didn't need a tax cut because you could purchase more. So, short point is, yes, it ends up, but it ends up with the Mexicans, whereas I think the intent of the government will be to how do I get the money and get it pushed to the Philippines and the Africans. So I don't see that tax cut coming personally because they don't have the fiscal headroom to do that. And again, even on there, since you've given me a chance, I can express my sort of sorrow. As a person who lives on dividend, the company pays tax at whatever 33%. Then when they distribute the dividend, they pay another 22% for the privilege of distributing it. If it were organized as a partnership, that tax wouldn't be there. And then when I receive it in my hands, with surcharge, I pay another 13% on that. So I'm paying tax at 56% rate on profits which are distributed by the company. It's, triple taxation. If these kinds of things get corrected, you might get people to go back and reinvest in companies who pay dividend. Some of our policies don't make sense. I'm hopeful the new direct tax code comes out and kind of streamlines all this. And you can do away with exemptions like you did for the corporate taxes and so on. But just get us, again to use the metaphor, if it's in a country of Africans and Filipinos, our tax laws are designed very elegantly for the Anglo-Saxon educated world. You need to simplify. I would rather have 2 or 3 mantras with the principles laid down and then just go ahead and let people run. And Anil said it very well. He said we are very focused on extraction of margin, whether it's a tax rate or whether it's a royalty. If we start thinking in terms of velocity, that's the way to get GDP to run. Today the mentality is if someone is running, I got to catch him. He must be running away because he's a thief. No, he's running because he's an athlete. Let him run. And if that change comes to the country, that's really where we can. Thank you so much.
So we know you have a long wish list when it comes to the budget. We have our next speaker, who's the finance minister as well. Manish, thank you so much for giving us
a huge round of applause, please, for Manish Chokhani.